Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to our first meeting of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific. And I want to welcome all my colleagues, as I say, to the very first hearing this Congress. And I want to acknowledge my friend from American Samoa, the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Feli Mavega. Eni, it's been a pleasure working with you over the years. And I welcome the opportunity now to sit side by side with you heading this committee. And it's, so I look forward to the opportunity to work as we all. Eni and I actually were the representatives from the House of Representatives to the UN for a year back in, I think it was around right after 2001, the attack on our nation for about a year. So it was an interesting time, and we've been friends for a long time now, even though we're different parties. We actually do get along in this institution. It's a very critical time for Asia, and I know we'll have plenty of work ahead for us over the next couple of years. And I'd also like to welcome all of our new freshman members, which is actually a majority of the members of this committee, so we welcome all of them to the Congress, and we're looking forward to working with each and every one of them and hope that they'll enjoy serving on this subcommittee, both Democrats and Republicans. I'd also like to welcome our distinguished witnesses, Assistant Secretary Robert Blake and Acting Assistant Secretary Joseph Yoon. Before we begin, the ranking member and I will make opening statements, and other members will be given 1 minute to make a statement if they should choose to do so, and then we'll get to the witnesses. Last Congress, I was honored to serve as chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and South Asia, which was a truly rewarding experience. It was a time of both great opportunities and tragedy. As the new chair of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, I'm happy to announce that South Asia is once again under the jurisdiction of this committee, the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. Historically and culturally, I think combining the two makes sense. They share transnational threats from terrorism and natural disasters to nuclear proliferation and human rights abuses. In November 2011, the Obama administration detailed its plan to strengthen American engagement and leadership in the Asia-Pacific region in order to improve regional security, promote U.S. values, and increase economic prosperity. This strategic rebalance toward Asia is also viewed by many as an attempt by the United States to address the growing political and military influences of China. Examining the administration's efforts to create a more integrated approach to the region over the past 2 years, much of the focus has been on Asia and Southeast Asia. We see this through the improved military relations with Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, the opening of a marine base in Darwin, Australia, and the positioning of littoral combat ships in Singapore. We also witnessed this in Burma, following the opening of its borders to the world and its pursuit of democratic reforms, in which the United States has played a key role, and also in the ongoing Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, negotiations that aim to create a high-standard free trade agreement linking the Asia-Pacific region. While there have been successes, it seems many of the priorities and goals described in the pivot are more ambitious rhetoric than detailed plans describing how to achieve long-term sustainable results. And one area that we see a disparity in is a sub-region that has been largely neglected from the rebalance strategy, and that's South Asia. Straddling the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and Java and South China Seas, South Asia bridges a world fraught with uprisings and civil strife to one that will drive global politics and the world's economy. It consists of the world's largest democracy, second most populous nation, one of the poorest countries, and one of the youngest overall demographics. As the center of the Indian Ocean rimland that extends from the Middle East to India and south to Indonesia, South Asia is a sub-region in need of strategic stability. The scene of a power struggle for energy security, the Indian Ocean maritime region holds the world's most important shipping and trade routes, accounting for 70% of petroleum product shipments and half the world's container traffic. It is in the recognition of this region's importance that this interlocked rivalry between China and India with the rivalry between the United States and China. The rise of China, India, and other Asian nations and the rapid growth in seaborne trade and dependence upon imported energy from the Indian Ocean through the Straits of Malacca has resulted in the unification of the Indian Ocean maritime region to the Pacific as one of geostrategic space in what some refer to as the Indo-Pacific region. Secretary Clinton used Indo-Pacific for the first time in November of last year to describe the integration of South Asia as part of the United States' broader strategic rebalance to Asia. I welcome this as a sign that India and the broader region will play a more critical role going forward. I do not believe the pivot will succeed unless the U.S. does more to build stronger relationships in South Asia, and with India in particular. India's cultural influence, pluralistic society, democratic government, and growing military power place India in a position to take advantage of future economic growth in East and Southeast Asia, while also contributing to regional security and achieving national security interests that both India and the U.S. share. While we have seen progress in certain areas of the U.S.-India relationship, many arenas are at a state of frustrating impasse. This is partly due to the divergence of various objectives in the region, historical distrust, and India's determination to maintain strategic autonomy. These concerns raise many questions about how to move forward. However, these obstacles should not impede efforts to place the U.S.-India relationship as a key feature of the broader U.S. strategy in Asia. The administration stated in December 2012 that its, quote, strategic rebalancing to Asia will continue with renewed vigor, unquote, and that U.S. engagement in South Asia would be central to the reinvigorated outreach. I hope the witnesses here today will elaborate on this statement and discuss how the administration is planning to continue the rebalance with a stronger focus on South Asia, not forgetting U.S. engagement with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, and Pakistan, and further elaborate on specific actions or commitments it plans to take in this effort to achieve more tangible results. And I now yield to the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Fali Mavega, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to say for the record how pleased and an honor for me personally to have you as chairman of this important subcommittee. And also I want to welcome our colleagues in the subcommittee as we will be discussing and I'm sure dialoguing some very important issues affecting this region of the world. I also want to offer my personal welcome to two gentlemen who will be testifying before our subcommittee. In all the years that I've been here, Mr. Chairman, this is the first time in history that we have now two assistant secretaries testifying before this committee. So I'm really, really blessed and very, very happy to see Secretary Blake and also Secretary Huon here with us this morning. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. I could not think of a better subject or issue that we should be discussing. As I've said for many years, in the years that I've served in this committee, in my personal opinion, nobody wanted to talk about Asia-Pacific issues because the entire mentality here in Washington, both in the Congress and previous administrations, was towards Europe and the Middle East. If we weren't bashing the Chinese, we were bashing the Japanese. Nothing positive in terms of our looking at the Asia-Pacific region as an important and integral part of our, what should be our relationship with this region. Today we are playing catch-up in a region that accounts for more than 60% of the world's population. In 2011, the Asia-Pacific region surpassed Europe to become the top exporter of merchandise. 2 years ago, or 2010, I'm sorry, the world's top container ports were in the Asia-Pacific region, including the top 5 container ports in the world are in the Asia-Pacific region. I remember a couple of years ago, the late Senator Daniel Inouye made an observation that for every 747 that flies across the Atlantic, 4 747s fly between the Pacific and the United States. The U.S. has a vital interest in making sure there's a free flow of global trade and commerce through the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. The Strait of Malacca is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. Thousands of vessels pass through the strait per year, carrying about 1/4 of the world's traded goods, including oil. About a quarter of the oil carried by sea passes through the strait. I might also comment, Mr. Chairman, that another very important strait that is connected to the Indian Ocean is the Strait of Hormuz between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We need to remember that as well. For the first time since 1979, Iran naval forces just crossed the Strait of Malacca and will dock in China, India, or Sri Lanka. Regarding Sri Lanka, Mr. Chairman, I agree with the Kerry Lugar congressional report, which declares we need to rechart U.S. strategy in Sri Lanka beyond humanitarian and political reforms. The U.S. simply cannot afford to lose Sri Lanka due to its strategic importance. Last week, I had the privilege of visiting Sri Lanka and met with President Rajapaksa for more than 2 hours. I also met with Governor of the Northern Province and personally visited Jaffna because I wanted to see for myself the post-conflict development since 2009, when Sri Lanka finally became the first country in the world to eradicate terrorism on its own soil by defeating the Tamil Tigers, which remains listed as the terrorist organization by 32 countries, including our own country, Mr. Chairman, India, Canada, and members of the European Union, and dubbed by the FBI as one of the most ruthless terrorist organizations in the world. After a 30-year terrorist conflict or war, the challenges Sri Lankan government faces are enormous, but the strides the government has made to rebuild in a way that establishes lasting peace and equality for all citizens should be firmly acknowledged. The United States should join Australia in praising the work the Sri Lankan government has done in the north and east of the island in such a short period since the war, as Australian Deputy Opposition Leader Julie Bishop and the parliamentary delegation she led recently stated on their visit. Regrettably, in the resolution it intends to submit again to the United Nations Human Rights Council, the U.S. fails to mention one, not even one positive development for Sri Lanka. Such failure suggests that the United States is not being even-handed when it comes to dealing with sensitive human rights issues across the globe. And I am, Mr. Chairman, deeply concerned that our inconsistent policies, which lead to a loss of credibility for the United States, which will negatively impact our relations in the Asia-Pacific region for years to come. So I call upon my government, the United States of America, to find a better way forward rather than using United Nations resolutions to destabilize developing nations like Sri Lanka while ignoring human rights abuses in nations like Indonesia, where our geopolitical and strategic and military interests supersede our human rights agenda. The U.S.-led United Nations resolution should also be withdrawn for focusing only on the last few months of the war and failing to acknowledge that for almost 30 years, Mr. Chairman, the Tamil Tigers hacked to death innocent women, men, women, and children in Sri Lanka, carried out some 378 suicide attacks, more than any other terrorist organization in the world. We also do not need to criticize Sri Lanka for borrowing money from China. And by the way, I was there, Mr. Chairman. In terms of our ability to provide assistance to these third world countries, China was able to provide Sri Lanka with $500 million of low-interest loans for them to rebuild their seaport, as well as a brand new international airport that I was there to witness. I also want to suggest that it is time for our government to begin a dialogue with the Chief Minister Modi, who may well be the next Prime Minister for India. The U.S.-India relationship is significant, as you have commented in your statement, Mr. Chairman. It is one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century, and Chief Minister Modi is a leading figure in that process. Chief Minister Modi's philosophy of bringing development to the doorstep of every poor person, every farmer, every worker, is a philosophy that transcends caste, culture, regional, and religious differences, and has led to a decade of unprecedented growth and development in the province or the state of Gujarat, a key state which has contributed considerably to India's economy and development. Companies like Ford and General Motors are setting up factories in Gujarat, and in a move that promises to strengthen U.S.-India relations now and in the years to come. I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman. I will leave the rest for another opportunity, but I do want to thank you and thank my colleagues for their attendance of this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair will recognize back and forth, as all the committees do, and we go by seniority, although we do go by who was here when the meeting actually began at that point, and then seniority from there. So that's the list I have, so that's the reason I'd be calling in the order that I am at this point. And we will now hear, for anyone who has a one-minute opening statement, we'll first go to Representative Holding from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for your time and your testimonies that we're going to hear. You know, there's been a lot of rhetoric put forward from this administration about a so-called pivot towards Asia and the Pacific, but, Mr. Chairman, I'd submit that that rhetoric has largely remained just that, rhetoric. The United States has always maintained an interest in the Asian and Indo-Pacific regions. This includes economic interests and established and emerging markets, but one that also includes strategic defense, national security interests, one that has once again been reinforced by the recent actions in North Korea. Any move towards the Asia-Pacific region must ensure both interests are given close and careful consideration. I look forward to getting the answers to numerous questions that remain from this administration regarding the pivot, and especially those policies impacting Southeast Asia. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for calling this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses. America's pivot to Asia is critical at this juncture and is a much-needed evolution of our foreign policy, particularly our shift to South Asia as we look at building a critical strategy around our relationship with India. The U.S.-Indian relationship is critical and vital to us both economically and strategically. You know, we find ourselves at a moment in time when we're going to be drawing down our troops in Afghanistan. India has a critical role in holding onto and maintaining some of the gains that we've made. India has a critical role in helping anchor stability in that region. Economically, you know, trade with India is vital. For my home state, California, we export over $3.7 billion of products annually, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. If we can strengthen our trading relationship and open up India's export markets, this will be very strategic in a bilateral way to both countries. I look forward to hearing both of the witnesses talk about this strategic relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you, gentlemen, for agreeing to testify, and of course all the guests as well. I'm privileged to be here, and I too agree with the administration's pivot on policy to this region, but it cannot be one of rhetoric only. It has to be one of action and robust action. We must, I think, provide confidence to our allies and friends in the region while recognizing the interests of China, but we need to also urge them to be responsible partners with all their neighbors regarding trade, human rights, and military activity, and I look forward to your testimony in that regard. Thank you.
The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Sherman.
Support the pivot to the Asia-Pacific region as to our diplomatic resources. But if it includes a pivot involving our military resources, we should reflect on the fact that we already have nearly 100,000 ground troops in the region, that confronting China over the islands it disputes with Japan could involve resources involving many tens of billions of dollars, and that Japan itself has not devoted all that much in the way of economic resources to the defense of these islands. The United States' relationship with India is based on a shared commitment to democracy. Both nations have suffered from terrorism, and the U.S.-India relationship, I think, will be pivotal both economically and strategically. This committee strongly supported, sent to the floor, and passed through the House a bill that included a provision calling for Voice of America broadcasts in the Sindhi language, and I hope that we will reach out to the people of Pakistan in the languages they speak, not just the languages spoken by the government officially. And I look forward to hearing the testimony.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you to the witnesses. Appreciate this opportunity to be here to learn more about the Indo-Pacific region. Obviously has very important implications for our national security, but also the American economy. I represent 19 small towns in eastern and southeastern Indiana, many of them with an agricultural and manufacturing-based economy. The countries in this region have companies doing business over in my area of the world. It's important we maintain those relationships as well. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Fleo-Mavaenga, for convening this important hearing. I'm pleased to hear the resolve from my colleagues talking about robust action, not rhetoric, as we look towards this pivot towards Asia and the Pacific. Coming from Hawaii, these exchanges and partnerships and friendships between countries across the Pacific and Asia, South Asia in particular, are really a way of life for us in Hawaii, both economically and culturally, and understand how this is vital, strategic, and really related to security now for our country, and that we have to remain committed to engaging these nations. I've been personally involved with engagements, including with the National Guard, been witness to many of the military exchanges and the economic and educational and cultural exchanges that have done volumes for us as a country, and look forward to being able to continue that work and hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panel here this afternoon. We'll begin with Ambassador Robert Blake, who is the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia at the U.S. State Department. As Assistant Secretary, he oversees U.S. foreign policy with India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, the Maldives, Bhutan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. He previously served as Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives from 2006 to mid-2009, and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Mission in New Delhi, India from 2003 to 2006. Since entering the Foreign Service in 1985, he served at the American embassies in Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, and Egypt, and we welcome you here this afternoon. And our other witness, I'd like to introduce Mr. Joseph Yoon, who is currently Acting Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific, also at the State Department. He was previously Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs under Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell before he left just a couple of weeks ago. Since entering the Foreign Service in 1985, Mr. Yoon has served at American embassies in the Republic of Korea, Thailand, France, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and we'd ask that each of the witnesses keep their presentations as close to 5 minutes as possible. And we also have a lighting system. You'll get a yellow light when you have 1 minute. When the red light comes on, we'd appreciate it if you'd wrap up. So we'll begin with you, Ambassador Blake.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks as well to the ranking member and to all the members of this committee for inviting me here today. Let me say at the outset that it's been a privilege and a pleasure to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ranking Member over the last several years, and we look forward to continuing that very close cooperation. Before I begin, I want to just congratulate the committee on the reorganization of the subcommittee to include South Asia together with the East Asia and Pacific region. Many of the policies that we have been promoting in the region over the past few years reinforce the subcommittee's new organizational structure. So we see this as a positive development that will help us to address the challenges and the opportunities presented by this dynamic part of the world. One quick note, the South Asia region that I cover consists of India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and the Maldives. So while Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, play a large role in South Asia, my remarks here today will focus mostly on India, the Asia-Pacific, and the greater connectivity between the two. This is also reflected in the more comprehensive written statement that I have submitted for the record. Mr. Chairman, to fully understand why South Asia matters, we need to first look at the Asia-Pacific as a single geographically coherent space, one that not only ends on our own shores, but also expands westward to encompass the Indian subcontinent. Much of the history of the 21st century will be written in this broader Asia-Pacific region, projected to become home to over 5.2 billion people by 2050. That history will have a profound impact on the people and the economy of the United States. Any discussion of South Asia has to start with India. It is one of our most trusted and valuable partners in the region, and really the foundation upon which greater regional economic cooperation and expansion will be built. Our relationship, from our burgeoning trade to defense sales and exercises to our growing education and clean energy partnerships, has never been stronger. Just think about how far India has come in the past 20 years, with a GDP 10 times what it was in 1993. What was then a closed economy is now the 13th largest trading partner of the United States in goods. And by 2025, India is projected to become the world's third largest economy. With that growth will come enormous resource constraints, particularly in infrastructure. Current estimates suggest that 80% of the infrastructure required to sustain and support India in 2025 has yet to be built. So we see an enormous opportunity in this growth to deepen our commercial partnership with India, working together with American companies to build the airports, power plants, water and sanitation systems, and fiber optic networks of India's future. Although the U.S.-India relationship is a topic that could easily take up our entire afternoon, I'd like to quickly shift our focus to India's immediate neighborhood, a region where prospects for economic growth loom larger than anywhere on Earth. Thanks in part to Burma's recent political and economic reforms, we now see unprecedented opportunities for trade and engagement between South and East Asia. Nowhere are those opportunities more pronounced than along the emergent air, road, and sea links between India, Bangladesh, Burma, and the rapidly expanding economies of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In the past year alone, trade between India and the countries of Southeast Asia has increased by 37%. This emerging Indo-Pacific economic corridor isn't just a boon for the region, it provides American businesses with substantial new markets. Mr. Chairman, just a few words in closing. We are bullish on the future of this region, but we are also clear-eyed about the challenges that we face. Terrorism, such as we saw last week in Hyderabad, regional rivalries, nuclear proliferation, refugees, human trafficking, and the potentially catastrophic effects of global climate change. But the architecture of cooperation we are building together with the countries of the region is helping meet these challenges, and we continue to view South and Southeast Asia, including the Indian Ocean, as a crucial driver for America's economic growth and prosperity. We must continue building the regional and bilateral partnerships at the heart of a more stable and prosperous and democratic Asia-Pacific, so that our own country can continue to grow and prosper in the 21st century. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Ambassador. We appreciate it. And now we'll move to Mr. Yoon. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Falimavenga, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to testify why South Asia matters in our engagement with the East Asia and Pacific region. Mr. Chairman, as you have pointed out, it is increasingly important that the U.S. views the Indian Ocean region and East Asia and the Pacific region in a coherent and integrated manner. The current organization of this subcommittee to include both South Asia and East Asia is an important recognition of this strategic imperative. I believe that this new vision will help the United States better address the key challenges and opportunities in the Asia-Pacific region. As a Pacific power, the U.S. is bound to Asia through geography, history, alliances, and economic ties. Growing numbers of American companies are investing in and exporting to rapidly expanding Asian markets. Asia-Pacific businesses are increasing their profiles in the U.S. and providing jobs for American workers. Record numbers of American citizens now live, work, and study in this part of the world. These connections underscore our significant stake in the region's stability and prosperity. Our department's multifaceted approach to the Asia-Pacific region reflects this reality. We have sought to amplify our political and security ties as well as our economic engagement. We are strengthening and modernizing our long-standing alliances with Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, which have for decades been the foundation for the region's stability. And given the importance and strategic importance and collective significance of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we have also increased our engagements with Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Our efforts with China, which include an unprecedented number of high-level and people-to-people interactions, aim to build a stable relationship grounded in reality, but also true to our principles and interests. On the economic side, we have elevated our engagement in the region through multiple avenues, from hosting APEC in 2011 to last July's commitment to connectivity, which brought together the largest grouping of U.S. and ASEAN government and business leaders ever. We're working on comprehensive and high-standard trade agreements in the region, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to level the playing field for American companies and advance a rules-based trading system. At the East Asia Summit last November, the President announced a new initiative called the U.S.-Asia-Pacific Comprehensive Energy Partnership, which cuts across ASEAN, APEC, and other Asian regional forums to promote the development of new and sustainable energy markets in the region. At the same summit, the President also announced a trade and investment engagement program with the 10 ASEAN countries known as the Enhanced Economic Engagement, which will deal with trade facilitation, investment rules, and digital economy issues. Across the region, the United States is seeking sustained adherence to democratic practices and improved governance. We press for improvements with those governments that fall short on human rights and support those struggling to promote the values we share. Our commitment to advancing freedom, democracy, and the rule of law has manifested itself in our steadfast support for reform and opening in Burma, where positive developments on a range of political and humanitarian concerns of the international community have allowed us to open a new chapter in bilateral relations. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to report that the message from the region to the U.S. has been clear. Asians are saying that the role of the U.S. in Asia is critical and that they want to see us even more engaged in diplomacy, security, trade and investment, and more programs linking Asians and Americans, such as education, cultural exchange, sports, tourism, just to mention a few. So why do South Asia and Indian Ocean regions matter to what the U.S. does in Northeast or Southeast Asia? The answer, we believe, lies in the fact that the Indian and Pacific Oceans now form a continuous throughway for global commerce and energy. China, Japan, South Korea, and others in the region depend upon the secure access of energy and raw material from the Middle East and Africa. As these trends continue, any significant disruptions of trade in Indian and Pacific Oceans will have serious global repercussions that would also be felt here at home by American workers. As our economic and strategic interests continue to span the breadth of the Indo-Pacific, we have an important stake in ensuring freedom of navigation, promoting respect for international law, and fostering greater cooperation and dialogue among countries of both regions and maritime security. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the testimony of both of our witnesses here this afternoon, and I'll now recognize each member for 5 minutes to ask questions, and I'll begin with myself. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. The first question I'll address to you, Ambassador Blake. The 2008 Indo-U.S. Civilian Nuclear Agreement was considered a watershed moment for U.S.-India relations. But 4 years later, many believe that it has failed to tie India closer to the U.S.-led global nonproliferation and arms control architecture. India has made no efforts to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or to voluntarily halt its production of fissile materials. The deal was also supposed to build a robust security relationship between the U.S. and India, serving as the nucleus to balance Chinese power. However, India's non-alignment 1.0 and now non-alignment 2.0 have made this goal a strategic nightmare. At the same time, in pursuit of a greater global presence, India seeks to join the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and the 4 major arms control groups, including the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Australia Group, and the Missile Technology Control Regime. Ambassador Blake, what is the outlook for India's participation in these groups? And with reference to the Indo-Civilian Nuclear Agreement, have the U.S. and India made any progress on resolving the nuclear liability issue, which has created an obstacle for a number of U.S. firms? What is the administration doing in order to move this issue forward?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman. Let me just talk a little bit about the nuclear deal first. As you say, this was one of the really transformative deals that was done in the course of the Bush administration. The Obama administration came in determined to try to continue that momentum. I think there's been some progress, but there's also still many challenges ahead. One challenge is that India passed a nuclear liability law that our companies do not agree with and do not think provide them sufficient protection from possible liability suits. And therefore, we have focused most of our efforts on trying to negotiate with the Indians and support our companies' efforts to negotiate what are called early works agreements. That are things like site preparation and early contracts and things like that, that could, again, pave the way for future civil nuclear contracts. The Indians have set aside several areas in Gujarat and in Andhra Pradesh for American companies to eventually build such plants, and we continue to work through our liability concerns with the Indian government. So we hope very much this year that one of these early works agreements can be signed by Westinghouse and the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, which is its counterpart. So I think there has been progress, but again, much work needs to be done. With respect to your comment about how India is non-aligned, actually I would respectfully disagree. India has moved very, very much closer to us now on defense cooperation. We now have the largest exercise program of any country in the world with India. And I think all 3 of their services very much appreciate the opportunity to exercise with ours. And there is, I think, growing coordination in that respect. Likewise, our defense sales relationship has grown from virtually nothing to more than $9 billion, with several billion more of sales pending now. So again, I think our militaries are growing much closer together, and there's great interest in developing closer interoperability and closer working relationships, and we'll certainly continue to build on those.
Thank you. And in the limited time, I have about a minute left here. Let me just touch on Sri Lanka. And I know my ranking member had brought up Sri Lanka, which can be a quite controversial issue, and there are 2 sides to a lot of the things that are said about this. And I've had many contacts with the government and also with the Tamils, and they, shall we say, they differ in a number of areas. And I would say that the attempts at reconciliation between the government and the Tamil people have been disappointing in many respects. Sri Lankan leaders, for example, are talking about repealing the 13th Amendment, which guarantees certain basic rights to provincial councils. And U.S. policy towards Sri Lanka has so far apparently not worked out, been able to convince the government to keep its basic agreements to bring reconciliation and political settlement to fruition. What steps has and can the administration make to urge the government to move towards a more genuine reconciliation with the Tamil community, and either one, but if you could keep it relatively short, because our time's now up.
Well, let me try to answer your question and also the ranking member's question simultaneously, because he talked about that in his statement. And let me just say with a little bit of background that, obviously I've been working on Sri Lanka now for 6 years. and know the country extremely well. I consider myself a friend of the country and a supporter of the country. And at the end of the conflict, as you know, there were many questions about the number of civilians that were killed at the very end of the conflict. An independent UN panel estimated that between 10,000 and 40,000 innocent civilians may have been killed. Nonetheless, the United States decided that it would support a domestic, that is a Sri Lankan domestic process, to try to get to the bottom of that and to investigate that and to develop what has now been called the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission process. But we did so with the understanding, Mr. Chairman, that there would be rapid progress towards reconciliation and accountability. And I must say, progress thus far on implementing the LLRC action plan has been slow, and we've been disappointed, as you say, that the government has not proceeded so far with elections for the Northern Provincial Council 4 years after the end of the war. We've been disappointed that there hasn't been a conclusion of the dialogue between the Tamil National Alliance, this umbrella group for the Tamil groups, as well as for the TNA dialogue with the government on devolution. And we've been disappointed that there have been some backward movement on democracy, as you say, things like the 13th Amendment, but also the recent impeachment of Sri Lanka's Chief Justice. So for that reason, last year we supported a resolution in the UN Human Rights Council to put additional pressure on Sri Lanka to implement its own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation report. We did so with the support of countries like India that voted yes, and a large majority of other countries in the Human Rights Council. I think there's good support thus far to have another vote this year to continue to urge Sri Lanka to implement its own report, and that's why we're pursuing that again this year.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Gentleman from American Samoa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to say to Secretary Blake, this is not in any way a personal attack on you in any way, but I do want to follow up on the chairman's question and concerns about the situation in Sri Lanka. I had mentioned in my statement about the double standard that we're applying as far as violation of human rights. And the sense that I have is, why is the most powerful country in the world picking on a small little country like Sri Lanka, the size of West Virginia, 60,000 square miles with only 3 million people, and yet in Sri Lanka we're talking about 21 million people living there. The serious question I have is that for 27 or 29 years, this country was in a state of civil war. It's not a conflict. It's not a question of the Tamil people asking for more autonomy. And we have to understand, not all Tamils are members of this terrorist organization called the LTTE, or Tamil Tigers, that our government, along with 32 other countries, also categorized as a terrorist organization. And in the process, you're talking about 27 years for some 80 to 100,000 Sri Lankans ended up dead, a lot of innocent men, women, and children. And what I'm trying to seek here is that there also was a country that had a civil war. It was the United States of America. For 4 years, we ended up with 600,000 of our soldiers died from that terrible conflict. And it wasn't a question of the southern states asking for autonomy. They wanted to secede and pull away from the mother country, just like the Tamil Tigers wanted to do in their efforts in seeking this war against the Tamil government. My concern here is that we are looking at such a small little sequence of this 2 or 3 months that now we're questioning, and the reason why we have this resolution before the United Nations Human Rights Council, but forgetting the fact that for 29 years, the Sri Lankan government has had to deal with this terrorist organization, that I just could not believe the atrocities that were committed by these people. And now overnight, we just think, oh, we've got to hit this resolution against them. This is where my concern with double standard. Our government, for the 10-year period that we were in war in Vietnam, Mr. Secretary, let's ask the tens of thousands of women and children, innocent, civilians that were exposed to Agent Orange when we were there for the 10-year period. Let's ask the people in Laos and Cambodia for the 6 million pounds of cluster bombs that we dropped there. These countries never declared war on us. Where is the consistency in our standards as far as human rights are concerned? That we're pointing the finger at this little country, Sri Lanka, and to think that perhaps that maybe we need to clean up our own backyard and suggest that maybe we be a little more consistent. If we're going to do it against Sri Lanka, let's make sure that we're clean ourselves. So I just wanted your comment on that. I've got only 1 minute left on this.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Let me just say, with respect to the LTT, we fully agree. The United States was one of the very first countries to declare the LTT a foreign terrorist organization, and we have a long line of public statements and other condemnations that we issued for the terrible acts of terrorism that they were responsible for. We also took concrete action to help the Sri Lankans. We gave them radar systems so that they would be able to detect LTT.
In fact, we helped the Sri Lankan government fight against the Navy that even the Tamil Tigers had.
So we, we certainly took a very uncompromising view with respect to the LTT. But again, at the very end of the war, the question is, what happened to those 10 to 40,000 civilians who were killed? And I think everybody in Sri Lanka believes that there needs to be closure on that question. And closure needs to be achieved through this Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission process. It's a domestic process, so it should have the support of the government, and we hope that that will continue, and that's the purpose of this resolution. But there needs to be justice, Mr. Chairman, for there to be closure, and there needs to be reconciliation between these communities. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And
I know I've only got 10 more seconds, Mr. Secretary. I just want to say that that was part of the subject that I discussed this personally with the president of Sri Lanka, and he is concerned. In fact, he's spending more time up there in the northern province and all the amount of resources they're trying to do to make this as part of the reconciliation process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fairley-Vega. And the gentleman from North Carolina was next, but isn't here. So I think the gentleman from Pennsylvania is next, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And either gentleman can answer the question. It's fairly general, and I want to get away from Sri Lanka if I could for just a moment. Not taking anything away from the effort and the gravity of the situation, but I'm concerned about the looming defense cuts in the United States and our commitments to the broader region, and along with our continued commitments to Europe and the Middle East and now Africa. And I'm wondering if you could enumerate what your view is of what we will need from a military standpoint to continue to balance or provide a balance in the region. And be fairly specific, if you could, on what your view is, either one of you or both of you, or what you think that our commitment should be and will need to be moving forward in the near and long term.
Thank you very much. As you know, in our region, in East Asian Pacific region, there are now about 29,000 troops in Korea, in South Korea, and about 40,000 in Australia. And of course, beyond that, the region of South China Sea as well as East China Sea and the Pacific rely for a Pacific Command, especially the Pacific Command Navy, to do everything that is needed to keep the oceans open. Mr. Chairman, this is a serious issue that if there is any shortfall in our budget, especially going to the military side, I think it will affect the operations we do, freedom of navigation exercises we do, and certainly a lot of bilateral and multilateral exercises we do. These are very important to, number one, project our forces in the region, and number two, to keep all the sea lanes open. And just last week, we concluded a multi-nation exercise in Thailand called Cobra Gold. And those are also very useful for keeping the troops in the region, working with our troops in the region. So my own view is that it will have significant effect. And similarly, it will also have significant effect on the diplomatic side, Mr. Chairman. We have embassies that needs to be open. We have obligations to our local employees. Often it is very difficult to follow them because they come under national law, not U.S. law. So there are severe constraints on both the security side and diplomatic side. Thank you.
Sir, we don't have American troops stationed in South Asia, but obviously we have a very expansive exercise program, and the Pacific Command is involved with Nepal, Bangladesh, and many other countries in various aspects from disaster management to counterterrorism cooperation. We haven't yet learned how all of that cooperation is going to be affected by these potential sequestration. But so I would just support what my colleague said.
Well, if I could, Mr. Chairman, just follow up then. Let's just say that the United States has to pull back a certain level of operational capability, fewer exercises, a diminished presence. Can you give us any thoughts to what scenarios you think might play out if the United States or its allies aren't present in that regard for keeping shipping lanes and sea lanes opening and providing a balance? Are there certain actions that other actors would or would not take in the region based on our lack of presence or diminished availability to be there?
I think we've seen about 2.5 weeks ago now, there was a third nuclear test by North Koreans. And certainly there is a lot of proliferation-related activities, goods going from Northeast Asia through Straits of Malacca to Middle East, Iran, and so on. So those things that we do in the region, it's not just about when there is an emergency, but rather it has to be daily type of activities. And similarly, I do believe that you have to do, for example, regular freedom of navigation exercise, because that's what makes assert our interpretation of law of the sea, and including what we can and what we should not do in EEZ. And so I think it's very important that there not be up and down in our activity, but rather we sustain the level of activity that we are committed to sustaining.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you.
Yield.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Ambassador Blake, Mr. Yoon, both and all of us talk about the great economic opportunity that exists between the United States and India and the South Asia region. Ambassador Blake, having spent as much time as you have there, can you comment on what some of the perceived threats are to that relationship and to the economic opportunities that exist?
Well, I think the main threat is the declining growth rate that has occurred in India because of declining investment, and because there has been a slowdown in the economic reform efforts of over the past several years. It's no secret that the Indian Parliament has been tied up in knots over debates about corruption and other such things, and so very little has gotten done. To its credit, they did pass a quite important reform to open up India for foreign direct investment in the multi-brand retail sector, which we think is very, very important. And they've taken some steps to try to accelerate the approval process for foreign investment. But much more needs to be done, and I think the Indians fully recognize that. And certainly our companies through the U.S.-India Business Council have given them a very rich menu of suggestions of things that could be done to open up in the areas of banking, in the areas of retail, in the areas of things like defense, all of which would, insurance is another one, that would tremendously increase the levels of foreign direct investment and help boost the levels of growth in India.
And obviously, opening up India's markets is beneficial both to our economy and our companies, and certainly helps India become a much more modern economy. Are there strategic things that we can do diplomatically to help speed along this process?
Well, very much so. We have a range of economic dialogues that we conduct with our Indian counterparts. The U.S. Trade Representative has something called the Trade Policy Forum. So there's a number of different initiatives that are underway that help, again, remove some of the blockages that do occur. But I should say that even with some of these problems, India remains one of the fastest growing economies in the world at 5%. And it's projected to be the third largest economy in the world by 2025. And our own trade continues to grow very substantially. It's quadrupled over the last 8 years, and it is growing at roughly 20% a year. So, you know, obviously we'd like to do even more, but I think we're very happy with the progress that has been made.
Fabulous. We certainly would. You know, shifting a little bit, I know you commented that Afghanistan is not part of the South Asia region, but obviously, as we draw down and bring our troops home, you know, it'll be critical to maintain some of the gains and some of the stability. Obviously, the U.S.-India relationship is a very strategic relationship here. From your perspective, what do you see as India's role in helping maintain stability in Afghanistan and the region entirely, and then what we can do, you know, diplomatically in the U.S.-India relationship?
Well, your question is a timely one, Congressman. We've just finished our latest trilateral dialogue with India and Afghanistan last week that I represented the United States at in Delhi. And we appreciate very much the significant role that India is playing in Afghanistan. In fact, we see India as kind of the economic linchpin for the future as our troops draw down, as their spending draws down. It's going to be much more important now to establish a private sector basis for the Afghan economy and to make a trade-based economy and not an aid-based economy. And India has such an important role to play in that. First, it has a very large investment program. It has invested in things like the Hajigak iron ore deposit that's going to be a major, probably $8 to $10 billion investment. It hosted a major investment conference last year to promote foreign investment into Afghanistan. It has its own very substantial assistance program of approximately $2 billion. And it very much has embraced this regional integration vision that Secretary Clinton and now Secretary Kerry have endorsed to open up all of these trade links to allow for example, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline, and other forms of infrastructure, road, rail, and other openings that will link up this region in a very significant way. And India is really at the heart of all of those efforts and is such an important partner for us.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. I would like to announce that we're supposed to have a series of votes any minute now, but we have about 15 minutes. We've got 3 more questioners, so I think we can probably, as a courtesy of the panel, wrap up, not have you come back. So if we keep our time, we should be able to do that. So the next gentleman is the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Committee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Salmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Blake, Mr. Yun. Thank you for being here today. I was privileged to be able to participate in a CODEL just in the last few weeks over with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, and the Philippines, and a lot of issues that we talked about, but the most pressing issue by far was the concern of proliferation of WMDs with North Korea. I'm also concerned about the potential with Pakistan, but the issue du jour seems to be North Korea. We had a hearing a couple of weeks ago with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I expressed my frustration, my feeling, and I think that is echoed by a lot of our colleagues, that so far the activities by the United Nations to try to dissuade North Korea from proliferating have been very impotent at best. I think we all understand that China has a disproportionate share of influence when it comes to motivating North Korea to do the right thing. But I'd like to pose a different thought. My concern, if North Korea continues in its path toward proliferation, is that how are we going to dissuade some of the other countries in the region, like Japan, like South Korea, and like Taiwan, from pursuing their own nuclear programs? And then what will happen if all hell breaks loose in terms of all these countries wanting to proliferate? What is going to happen to economic stability in the region? What are we going to do, since what we're doing right now is clearly not working? What are we going to do to move the ball up the field and properly motivate North Korea? The chairman of the full committee has recommended that maybe we take a look at financial institutions that provide financial services for North Korea, and maybe we take a look at possibly freezing assets, as we've done in the past with Iran and in the past with North Korea. Like your thoughts on any and all issues. I think it's time that we think outside the box and we do everything that we can. Otherwise, I think it's gonna destabilize pretty quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is, of course, I think the most serious problem that we have in Northeast Asia today. Two weeks ago, North Korea announced that it had done its third nuclear test. First one was 06, 09, and now. And of course, in that interim, they have, I believe, improved their capabilities. And I think the first thing we have to do is make sure that international community is unified in their response to North Korea. And that has to be the burden of UN Security Council. At the moment, we are negotiating in UN Security Council a resolution which we believe should have Chapter 7 incorporated, as well as additional sanctions incorporated. Mr. Chairman, without having the international community with us, any kind of sanctions become very difficult to enforce. And I believe once we have very tough UN multilateral sanctions, thereafter it is time to enforce our own. How, if for example, if UN agrees in Security Council to do financial sanctions, as you have suggested, then we will implement them. But I think to go ahead and do the unilateral ones could be questionable in value if other countries don't join us. So I think, number one, it is very important to have multilateral sanctions. Mr. Chairman, this has been a problem for a long time, not just since 2006, but North Korean nuclear program has been there probably since the late 60s. So I would say we need to take a longer-term view, not rather to see it. If they have done this much in 40 years, I think to some extent the deterrence has worked. And of course, in the 70s, there was a history of South Korea wanting its own nuclear program, which we persuade them not to have. With regards to position of South Korea, Japan, as you mentioned, Taiwan, of course, we have very strong mutual defense treaties, both with South Korea and Japan, and you are out there in the region, Mr. Salmon, and you realize the value of them. I think it is safe to say we're working very, very close with our Japanese and South Korean colleagues to see this in a very unified vision. But ultimately, China, which has a long border with North Korea, a lot of burden is on them. I think you're right in that, sir.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. We've got about 9 or 10 minutes left on the clock, and we've got 3 people now here that want to ask questions. I'd ask unanimous consent that we reduce it to 3 minutes, and then all 3 can get in, if that's okay. Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I agree with and appreciate many of the concerns that have already been brought up. And again, just recognize the importance of these relationship building opportunities and partnerships. Mr. Yoon, you mentioned Cobra Gold. I've also been involved with Garuda Shield, Yamasakura, and other types of exercises that I've seen firsthand what benefits can come from these types of exchanges in really being proactive so that we're not getting to a point of where we're talking about very real tactical threats. as we're looking at budget cuts, which is another issue that I know we're all thinking about very seriously, I just wanted to hear from you about some of the other resources that we have available to us to reach that same objective, one of which we have based in Hawaii, the East-West Center, which has been a very vital resource to us nationally, having a alumni of 55,000, over 600 partner organizations, and would like to hear briefly from both of you how you have utilized the East-West Center, as well as how you see the future relationship between the State Department and the center continuing, especially as we look at this rebalance towards Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you very much. I think East-West Center has been crucial in building relationship and exchanges in Asia and us. Hawaii, therefore, has become center of so many think tanks and so many military and civilian diplomats, as well as politicians. I think it would be really a shame if we were to reduce funding for East-West Center, and we'll be very supportive of sustaining it as much as possible.
I would strongly second that. We have a parade of South Asians who go to the East-West Center. I myself have addressed it several times, and it's one of our premier institutions, and I hope we can do everything we can to preserve funding for it.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Thank you very much. The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just get right into it. It is a travesty that the United States has such a integrated economy, and our economic well-being is so tied to the world's worst human rights abuser, namely China, and that we have not developed as much economic relationship and as great an economic relationship as we have with India. And it just seems to me that this is something we've got to come to grips with. This is out of sync with the long-term interest of the people of the United States, because in the long run, if we just ignore the totalitarian nature of the Chinese regime, we're going to pay a price, and that's already becoming very evident. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership and starting out this way for this new session of Congress. Let's hope in this session of Congress we recognize that China is playing an increasingly negative role that's got to be addressed, and it will be addressed by our relationship with other countries in Asia like India. Today we see the Chinese supporting, for example, just what they're doing with Pakistan. The Chinese are helping this state sponsor of terrorism. They are trying to have a power grab for the rare minerals, the oil, the gas, and other natural resources of Central Asia. And we've got to come to grips with this. And I would hope that that those of you in the executive branch, that we work together to reshape America's basic policy towards Asia, so that instead of a tilt towards China with a blind eye towards human rights and democracy, that instead we, with both eyes open, focus on trying to get better relations with India and those other countries who are struggling for democracy. That's my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And because of time, I think the statement speaks for itself. We'll turn to the gentleman from Virginia for 3 minutes, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And picking up on Mr. Verbark's statement, Ambassador Blake, I assume you would agree that there's something to that in terms of, with the end of the Cold War and with the rapprochement between the United States and India, there are new opportunities for creating space among many relationships, including the juxtaposition with China.
Mr. Connolly, nice to see you again.
Likewise.
We have been very proud of the progress we've made in our relations with India, but I think, and India itself has made tremendous progress in its relations with China, particularly on the economic front, where their trade is almost $70 billion now and is their fastest growing trading partner. They still have some tensions on border issues and things like that, but both of us have been clear that the progress that we're making in our respective relations with China is not coming at the expense of the other. We're not seeking to contain China. We're trying to engage China as much as possible. And certainly that's, in my 4 years working on this job, I've spent a lot of time trying to get China to work more closely with us on our central objectives in places like Afghanistan, to get them to invest more in the infrastructure there.
And I would agree with everything you're saying. I by no means was one suggesting containment or at the expense of. But in terms of the richness of the fabric of South Asia,
right.
The emerging relationship that did not exist heretofore between the United States and India, it seems to me, is definitely in our mutual best interest,
right.
and especially in light of unfolding facts and developments in the region.
Absolutely.
One more question, if I may, for both of you. In the so-called pivot to Asia, or rebalancing in Asia, I've seen some documents that talk about the purpose of all of this, new base, maybe renegotiating bases in the Philippines and elsewhere in the region and so forth, and plus existing treaty obligations, is to deter aggression. I am very worried about that expression, because presumably it means more than deterring pirates. And I'm worried about false expectations, that it raises expectations in the region that the United States will extend its defense umbrella, and that's a very difficult expectation to meet. How are we managing those expectations?
In 30 seconds.
We're managing pretty well. No.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, Mr. Conner, I think you're 100% right. I think to emphasize deterring aggression at the expense of others, I think it's misleading. I would say pivot to Asia is, by and large, mostly about our economic presence. We need to be there to take advantage of the increasing economic value that is out there, investment, trade. I mean, look at, opening up of Southeast Asia. American companies have tremendous advantage in infrastructure. Look at GE, look at Boeing, look at how we build airports. So I think that has to be the #1 emphasis, sir.
And the gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank the panel here this afternoon. Members will have 5 days to submit additional questions or extend their remarks. The panel did an excellent job here this afternoon. We appreciate it. If there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.